Okay, so this is labor and government regulation, and your learning target is that you can explain how productivity increases in human capital, unions and other factors determine wages and income. So you have some focus questions. You're going to be looking at how do labor unions affect labor demand and supply, what's a union shop and a closed shop, and then how many states have right to work laws, and then what are some of the unintended effects of regulation. We have key terms here: labor union, closed shop, the Taft-Hartley Act, the union shop, strike, and then right to work law. So what is a labor union? It's an organization of workers that tries to improve working conditions, wages, and benefits for its members. Who joins a union? Well, there's about 14.7 million wage and salary workers that belong to a union in the United States workforce. The public sector, meaning government employees, they make up 33.9% of union membership. And then if you compare that to like private sector work, they comprise only 6.4%. And then we have what are called protective service occupations, like police, firefighters, things like that. They make up 33.9% of union membership. And then we have education, training, and library occupations make up another 33.8%. When it says education, it means elementary, high school, and college. So who joins a union? Well, there are more men than women in union membership. Black workers are more likely to be union members than white, Asian, or Hispanic workers. The average median weekly earnings of a union worker is $1,051 compared to $806 for a non-union member. Hawaii and New York, they have the highest union membership rates, and North Carolina and South Carolina, they have the lowest union membership rates. The demand for union labor. So an objective of a labor union is to obtain higher pay for its members. And so the union, they have to direct their activities to increase the demand for the labor that they provide. So what they do is they decrease the supply of labor, or they can do both, okay? Increase the demand or decrease the supply. So as the demand for labor increases, that means that the wage rate will increase, all other things remaining the same, which is what we always do in economics. So the supply of labor, one way to do this is by having what's called a closed shop, which is a business that only hires union members. Now this type of workplace is illegal in the United States today, and this was prohibited back in 1947 with the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act by Congress. Then we have what's called a union shop. This is where firms hire non-union members, but they require them to join the union within a certain amount of time. It could be 6 months. And then we have what's called an agency shop, and these will hire non-union workers, and they do not require them to join the union in order to keep their job. Non-union workers are required to pay what are called union dues or some sort of similar fee, and they are covered by the union contract. So there's different kinds of shops here: closed, union, and agency. Okay? This one's illegal. These two exist. This one, even though it's called a union shop, you don't have to be a union member immediately, but you are required to within a certain amount of time. Agency shops, you're not required to be in a union, but you do have to pay what's equivalent to a union due because you're covered by their contract. Collective bargaining, it's the process in which union and company representatives, they meet and they negotiate a new labor contract. And so some of the things that they're looking for in these contracts are like, what are the wages and benefits? And this could be anything from pay increases to how much overtime you have to work, planned raises, and then other benefits, moneyed benefits. And then they talk about working conditions. So this can be safety, comfort, responsibility, or any other issue that needs to be negotiated and written into a contract. Then we have job security. This is one of the union's primary goals. It's to secure jobs for its members. And so the contract spells out the conditions under which a worker can be fired. So there's 3 aspects to it of collective bargaining. Now unions, they specifically try to increase the wages of their membership. So in order to be successful in putting pressure on business firms, a union needs most or preferably all of its workforce to be unionized. It can't be 30% of it. It can't even really, even at 50% it's tough. So one of the most powerful tools that a union has is its ability to organize a strike, a walkout, or a work stoppage. And we've talked about this in U.S. history before. So this specific act is designed to cost the firms money, and it forces them to come to the table to discuss terms that the union wants. So firms, they can try and replace these union workers with non-union workers. They're called scabs by union workers. But this can be difficult because, depending on the skill or the trade of the workers, that may not be possible. One of the things that can be done to try to bring labor and management together is mediation or arbitration. So mediation is used to avoid economic losses of a strike. So you get a third party. They come in and they try to settle this dispute. If you guys remember back in U.S. history, like Theodore Roosevelt did this, Woodrow Wilson did this, but it's a third party, okay? And what they do is the mediation, it's a settlement in which a neutral mediator, could be a judge, it's just a third party. They listen to both sides' perspectives, and then they try to find an acceptable solution for both sides. Then we have arbitration, and this is what happens if mediation fails. And they go to an arbiter, and this is a settlement technique, which again is a third party. They review the case, but they impose a decision, and that decision is legally binding, okay, for both sides. Mediation, there's no binding resolutions. Arbitration, it's a binding legal resolution, okay. Membership in unions has actually declined for 3 different reasons. First is the expansion of what are called right-to-work laws, and this is what was passed in the Taft-Hartley Act back in '47. And what it does is it allows states to pass what are called right-to-work laws. And these are laws that specifically ban mandatory union membership at the workplace. So of course that's going to decrease union membership. Second is economic trends. Unions were traditionally strongest in the manufacturing sector, and they represented what are called blue-collar workers, or people that have industrial jobs. The thing about blue-collar jobs is they've been declining in the United States since the 1960s at a pretty steady rate. They make up a smaller percentage than ever of the economy today. The United States has transitioned away from manufacturing/industrial jobs to service jobs, or then most service jobs, unfortunately, are minimum wage jobs. Okay, and then also unions were successful, especially during the Second World War, or maybe even before that, during the Depression. They were able to get things like higher standards of workplace safety, higher benefits like a 40-hour work week, a minimum wage, all of these things that unions were fighting for. Remember the 8-8-8, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of play, 8 hours, how did that work? Yeah, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of play, 8 hours of what we will. Or 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours of what we will. They got those things. And so the desire or the need for union membership has declined as a result of that. So currently there's 26 states and then the U.S. territory of Guam that have passed what are called right-to-work laws, in which workers are given a choice when it comes to becoming a union member or not. So labor unions, they can still operate in these 26 states and Guam, but workers cannot be compelled to become members of a union in order to keep that job. Now Kentucky, they became the 27th right-to-work state, and this was enacted by House Bill 1 on January the 9th, 2017. Now Missouri, they rejected the right-to-work laws with 33% that were voting in favor of it. So before Kentucky, before 2017, there were 26 states and Guam. Now there are 27 states and Guam. Okay. Missouri, they rejected it. This is what it looks like. So if it's in green, that means they have right to work. So there's Guam. Puerto Rico doesn't have it. American Samoa doesn't have it. I don't actually know what MP stands for. Then these are Virgin Islands. Might be Mauritanian. But like Hawaii doesn't have it, Alaska doesn't have it, California doesn't have it. Michigan does, and Indiana does. And this is because for most of its history, Michigan in the 20th century was a labor state, and unions they voted democratically. And things have changed. And so under the Snyder administration, Michigan switched to right to work. So there's 2 different views of labor unions. There's the traditional view, is that labor unions they're an obstacle to establishing reasonable work standards, and thus companies that employ union labor they're less competitive than non-union shops. That's the traditional view. So labor is an obstacle. Okay. A newer view states that the labor union is a valuable collective voice for its members in dealing with management. So there are some benefits to unions according to the new view, and that is that instead of individual employees having to discuss like some sort of sensitive topic with an employer, the labor union does it for them. And this could be anything when it comes to wages, safety issues, sexual harassment, any of that stuff. So overall, the labor union makes the employees, they feel confident that they have somebody that has their back. Okay, they feel less intimidated by management because they're not going it alone, and this creates a greater sense of security in the work that they're providing. So these positive feelings, it's believed, can translate to happier and then therefore more productive employees. And so there is some evidence that shows that union firms have a higher rate of productivity versus non-union firms. And productivity can increase, productivity may increase because union members, they have a sense of a voice through their union when it comes to dealing with management. And they also feel more secure in their work. And so that creates a sense of ease or peace, which makes them happier, which makes them more productive. So here's just a brief history of the labor union movement. So national unionism began in the United States following the Civil War. And labor unions, they have a great effect on the U.S. economy. And there's, you need to have some awareness at least of like the development. So the very first union in the United States was the Knights of Labor. It was organized 4 years after the Civil War, 1869. Then we have the American Federation of Labor. They have the Norris-LaGuardia Act, which was passed in 32. That's a Depression era. The Wagner Act, again, Depression era. The Congress of Industrial Workers, Depression era. The Taft-Hartley Act was passed. Remember, this is where there's some pushback on unionization. And then we have the AFL and the CIO. They merge in 1955. So they broke apart in 38. They come back together in 55. And then we have the Landrum Griffin Act that's passed. So this is the Knights of Labor. It's organized in 69. It's called the Knights of Labor. At the height of its membership, it had 800,000 workers. They welcomed anybody who worked for a living. So this could be a farmer, which in 69 was 69 was the majority of the population of the United States. Skilled and unskilled workers, and then liquor dealers were not welcome though as parts of the Knights of Labor. So this is like part of the whole temperance movement that was developing. The thing of it is on May 4th, 1886, there's like 100,000 members of the Knights of Labor, and they're protesting at the McCormick Harvester Works in the Haymarket Square in Chicago. So this is a big issue because this, I don't know, this protest becomes violent. Somebody tosses a bomb or an explosive device into the crowd. It kills several people, including police officers. It's not proven that it's the Knights of Labor that did this, because if you remember the history, this is also a period in which anarchists are on the rise too. So it could have been an anarchist versus a labor union, but to people who were against labor, there's no difference between an anarchist and a unionist. So the Knights of Labor is going to completely collapse by 1917. Now, the American Federation of Labor, this forms in 1886. It's under Sam Gumpers, and he focuses around skilled labor, which is a smaller number of people. So by 1904, it's got 2 million members. By 1920, it's 5 million, but it's going to fall in 1930 to 3 million workers. Okay, and the reason it falls is if you think about what happens between 1920 and 1930, this is where the Depression begins. So the AFL is almost completely focused on getting better pay and improving the working conditions for its skilled workers. Some early court decisions that you need to know about is that in the early days, unions were considered to be illegal conspiracies, and union leaders were regularly prosecuted and sued. So in 1842, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, it ruled that unions were not illegal, but that certain practices that they undertook were. And then we have the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was supposed to break up monopolies, but was instead used against labor unions, because it declared that every person who shall combine or conspire with any other person or persons to monopolize any part of trade or commerce shall be guilty of a misdemeanor. And I mean, the wording of this, that would have applied to labor unions, but that definitely wasn't the intent of Congress. But it will be clarified in the next antitrust law. But in the early 1900s, the courts, they had this power, and they still have it. It's called an injunction, and they used injunctions against labor unions to prevent strikes. So injunctions are court orders, and originally they're designed to prevent damage to property when it's thought that other court processes would be too slow, like labor taking management to court. And so these injunctions were used by employers all throughout the 1900s, well, the early part of the 1900s, to keep labor unions from having the ability to strike. So in 1932, we have the passage of what's called the Norris-LaGuardia Act, and this really changes the climate for labor unions, because what it does is it doesn't make injunctions illegal. What it does, though, is it limits the use of injunctions. So it declared that workers would be free from interference, restraint, or coercion of employers in choosing their union representatives. And then the main purpose of the act is to restrain the use of injunctions against labor unions. So the Norris-LaGuardia Act is a ray of hope for labor. We have the Wagner Act. This is a huge deal. This was passed in 1935 by Congress as part of the New Deal, and it required that employers bargain in good faith with their workers, and the act also made it illegal for employers to interfere with their employees' rights to organize or to join a union. So the big thing that the Wagner Act did, other than what I just stated, is that it created the National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB. And the NLRB then and now investigates any unfair labor practices, and it can punish, it has the power to punish labor. Not labor, I'm sorry, it has the power to punish firms. You can fine them, you can be found guilty, and you can face jail. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, so the Norris-LaGuardia and the Wagner Acts, they led to this push for an expansion of union organization by major industries such as steel and automobiles. And this caused internal tension, because remember, the AFL is looking not for industry-wide unions, but for skilled labor specifically, what are called craft unions. This could be plumbers, electricians, carpenters, whatever. But starting in 1938, John Lewis and others, they formed what's called the Congress of Industrial Organizations of the CIO, and it successfully was able to organize industries that had not been able to successfully unionize in the past, like the steel industry, the rubber making industry, the textile industry, the meat packing industry, and then also the automobile industry. So the AFL and the CIO, they saw membership rates increase until the end of World War II. Now the CIO will be ejected from the AFL. Okay, so they'll be competing, but AFL will continue to focus on skilled labor, where the CIO is more like an umbrella. It covers entire industries, and they go their separate ways. But in 1955, the two unions, the AFL being a trade union and the CIO being an industrial union, they will merge and create what's called the AFL-CIO. Okay, that's in 1955, and the reason is because union membership has declined for both groups. The Taft-Hartley Act was passed by Congress because the mood that the nation and Congress had towards union began to evolve after World War II. And this is because of a series of strikes. And this is in 46, and it makes Congress decide that maybe it's time to reassert firms' control and labor's need to follow the needs of the market. So the act gave states the right to pass right-to-work laws. Southern states, they did this right away. Northern states and western states tended to resist this, but over time, more states have begun to pass what are called right-to-work laws, which limits union membership. The Landrum Griffin Act is passed in 1959, and its purpose is to police internal affairs of labor unions, because labor unions by this point had been infiltrated by the mafia, the mob. Okay, what the act specifically did was it called for regular union elections, and that they had to use secret ballots instead of people knowing how you voted and who you voted for. And it required union leaders to report on their union's finances. Okay, it also prohibited former convicts or communists from holding union office. And the Landrum Griffin Act was passed because the U.S. public became concerned during the 50s that labor union leaders had misappropriated funds, which they had, and that they were involved in corruption, which they were. So specifically, the Landrum Griffin Act is passed to remedy this situation, okay? Because the U.S. public is calling for it. That's exactly what they do, okay? And it still works. Within your lifetime, I think it was just a few years ago, actually, the union that dealt with Chrysler was found to be guilty of taking bribes from Chrysler. And so some of them have been found guilty, some of them have pled guilty, okay? How do we have this thing enforced? It's because of this thing right here, the Landrum Griffin Act. So specifically, there's been a growth in public employee unions from the 60s and the 70s. Okay, public employee unions, they grow, and these unions are comprised of like local, state, and federal government employees, so police officers, firefighters, like city clerks, people like that. Just know that it grew in the 60s and the 70s. That's when it began. All right, then we have government regulation. We know what government regulation is. We've talked about this before. It shifts the curve to the left. Some government regulators that you need to know are the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, and what they do specifically is they protect workers against occupational injuries and illness. They make people wear hard hats, they make people wear harnesses, they have people do things like take breaks if you're an office worker so that you don't have deteriorating posture, things like that. Then there's the Consumer Product Safety Commission, or CPSC, and what it does is it sets a minimum standard for potentially unsafe products. So like you can't have teddy bears full of like sawdust and things like that because kids will rip them open, eat the substance inside of them. Then we have the Environmental Protection Agency, which regulates the amount of pollution that firms can emit into the air or into the rivers or into the land, things like that. And this isn't a Democrat or Republican thing because like it's both. Like the EPA was established by the Nixon administration, which is Republican, okay? It's not a question of should there be regulation, it's how much regulation. So there's costs and there's benefits of government regulation. Regulations definitely come at a cost, and when I say cost, I literally mean dollars, but also comes in number of jobs and things like that. People who would counter that, yes, regulations cost money, they would say that while the costs are high, the benefits exceed the costs. Now, from an economist's point of view, regulations have a cost and a benefit. So if regulations to limit air pollution create cleaner air, this results in fewer people being sent to the hospital for circulatory problems like asthma, that's a benefit. If the same regulation, though, led to the shutdown of a local coal plant that cost the local and the state government a major source of its tax revenue, and then also led to unemployment of like hundreds of thousands or 2,000s of workers, then that's, maybe that's regulation that's gone too far. So the point being that regulation, it's not a black and white, it's not a good and bad thing. It's a mixture of the two, and we just have to figure out like what's the balancing point for cost to benefit. Okay. There's always unintended effects when it comes to regulation, just as there are cost and benefits. It's the role of the economist to point out to the people that make the decisions, the politicians, like what are possible unintended effects of this regulation. That's it. Thanks, guys.